Cowboy saw Apache forced into the chapel, and the bell that rang marked their judgment. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Jack Dalton had been riding for hours, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty landscape. The quiet was a familiar companion, one he welcomed in his life. But as he approached the small chapel at the edge of town, something felt wrong. The sound of hooves echoed behind him, and Jack turned his head to see a group of men leading a young Apache woman, bound and forced into the chapel. Her eyes were filled with fear, but there was something else, something stronger, a resolve that Jack could see despite her situation. He dismounted slowly, tying his horse to the post just outside the chapel, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and confusion. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew it wasn't right. As he stepped closer, he could hear the murmurs of the crowd gathered outside, their voices rising in an almost fevered pitch. They had gathered to witness something. But what? A judgment? A trial? Or something far darker? Jack moved closer to the entrance, peeking inside through the crack in the wooden door. The Apache woman was kneeling in front of a small altar, her hands still bound, her head bowed low. The sheriff, a man Jack had known for years, stood beside her, his face grim. The bell above the chapel door rang with a low, mournful toll, sending a shiver down Jack's spine. That bell was a symbol of judgment. No one who entered the chapel left the same way. And yet, this was a woman, an innocent woman, forced into this space against her will. What had she done to deserve this fate? Jack's mind raced, but before he could move, the door swung open, and the sheriff stepped out. He looked at Jack with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Dalton," the sheriff said, his voice rough. "You better turn around and leave. This is no place for a man like you." But Jack was already stepping forward. He wasn't going to leave. Not now. Not when he could see the injustice in front of him. "What's going on here?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. "She's guilty of nothing," the sheriff replied, his hand twitching towards his gun as if he feared Jack might try something. Jack took a step closer. "I've known you for years, and I've never seen you this way. What's really happening here?" The sheriff looked around nervously. "You don't understand. She's one of them. And we have to make an example of her." Jack shook his head. "An example? For what?" The sheriff didn't answer, and Jack didn't need him to. He could see the truth in the sheriff's eyes. This wasn't about justice. This was about power, fear, and control. The bell tolled again, a final, mournful sound. And in that moment, Jack made his decision. He wasn't going to let this woman suffer because of something she had no control over. He walked past the sheriff, heading straight for the Apache woman. "I'll be damned if I let you do this," Jack muttered under his breath. The sheriff reached out to stop him, but Jack was already too far into the chapel. The Apache woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Jack untied her hands, and she stood up slowly, as if unsure of what was happening. The sheriff watched, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You're making a mistake, Dalton," the sheriff warned, his voice shaking. Jack turned to face him, his jaw set. "No, Sheriff. The mistake was already made the moment you let this happen." The tension in the room thickened as the sheriff took a step forward. But before anything could happen, the bell rang once more, its deep chime filling the chapel. The door burst open, and a dozen Apache warriors appeared, their faces grim, their eyes locked on the sheriff. The balance had shifted. The sheriff's hand went to his gun again, but Jack knew this time, it wouldn't matter. The judgment had already been passed. The bell had spoken. And there was no turning back now. As the Apache warriors stepped forward, their presence filled the small chapel with an intensity that Jack Dalton had never felt before. They moved with purpose, their eyes focused, unwavering. Each of them wore the scars of battle and the solemnity of men who had lived through more than most could imagine. The air seemed to grow thick with tension, and even the sheriff hesitated, his hand still hovering near his holster. Jack stood firm, his gaze steady on the Apache woman, who now stood tall beside him, her hands free. Her name was Waya, and in that moment she was no longer the helpless woman bound and dragged into this chapel. She was something more. She was someone who had been unjustly treated, and now, she was standing with the one person who dared to defy the system. The sheriff took a step back, his eyes darting from Jack to the warriors who were now surrounding the building. He was no longer in control of the situation. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no turning back. "You've made your choice, Sheriff," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "Now you'll see what happens when you force someone into a corner." The sheriff's face reddened, but he didn't draw his gun. Instead, he looked to the warriors, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle this new threat. The leader of the warriors, a tall man with a face that looked carved from stone, stepped forward. His eyes locked with Jack's, and for a moment, there was silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. The leader's voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of years of experience. "This woman has been wrong," he said, his words not asking for permission but stating a truth. "And we will not stand idly by while she is condemned." The sheriff opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The warriors moved in unison, their eyes never leaving the sheriff or the few men who had followed him into the chapel. Jack could feel the shift in the air, the way the balance of power had shifted from the sheriff to the Apache tribe. They were no longer outcasts. They were no longer the victims. They were now the force that would decide the fate of this land, and Jack could feel the weight of that responsibility resting on his shoulders. Waya stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the sheriff, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Not fear, but something deeper. Something that told him she had been waiting for this moment. "You think you can control me," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "You think you can use the law to keep me in chains. But the law means nothing when it's built on lies." The sheriff's face tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might snap. But instead, he took a deep breath, lowering his hand from his gun. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't your fight. You don't belong here." "No," Waya replied, her voice strong. "This is my fight. This is our fight." She turned to Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've helped me, but this is just the beginning. We're not just fighting for me, Jack. We're fighting for all of us." Jack nodded, understanding now. This wasn't about saving one woman. It was about something much larger. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The warriors behind him shifted, their eyes scanning the crowd, their hands resting on their weapons. The sheriff's men were outnumbered, outmatched, and they knew it. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his voice calm but filled with determination. The leader of the Apache warriors stepped forward once more, his gaze never leaving the sheriff. "Now we take control of this land," he said. "And we do it together." Jack felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. The warriors were here to stay, and they would fight for justice, no matter what it took. As the bell tolled again, its sound resonating through the chapel, Jack knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where the wrongs of the past would be righted, and the future would be shaped by those who dared to stand up for what was right. The tension in the chapel thickened as the Apache warriors stood in place, unwavering and resolute. Jack Dalton felt the weight of the moment, knowing that what had started as an unjust moment for Waya had now escalated into something much larger. The bell's tolling had signaled not just a judgment, but a turning point. The warriors who had gathered behind him were not just men of battle, they were men of honor, fighting for a cause far greater than any one individual. Sheriff Caleb Montgomery, his face red with frustration, took a step back. He had no power left in this situation. His hand, which had previously hovered near his gun, now rested limply at his side. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, some with disbelief, others with uncertainty. The townsfolk had been raised on fear, taught to view the Apache with disdain and suspicion, but today, things were different. Wya's voice cut through the heavy silence, her words echoing with the power of truth. "I am not the enemy here," she declared, her gaze locking with the sheriff's. "I am not the one who has wronged anyone. You have mistaken justice for vengeance, and that is where you have failed." The sheriff opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He could see the conviction in Wya's eyes, a strength that made him feel small, and he realized then that this was not about him. This was about the generations of pain and misunderstanding that had shaped the lives of those like Wya. The warriors stood firm, their expressions unreadable, but the message they sent was clear. This was not a battle of violence. This was a battle for respect, for recognition of their humanity. Jack stood quietly, watching as the sheriff's resolve began to crumble. He had always known that the sheriff was a man caught between the weight of duty and the burden of prejudice, but today, it was clear where his loyalties lay. "It's over, Caleb," Jack said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You've lost this fight." The sheriff met Jack's eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. But in that silence, something passed between them, an understanding. Caleb took a deep breath, and then, without a word, turned and walked away, his boots heavy with the weight of defeat. As he left the chapel, the crowd that had gathered outside seemed to exhale as one, a collective breath of relief. Jack turned to Wya, who was now standing tall, her hands free, her shoulders straight. She was no longer the woman who had been dragged into this place by force. She was someone who had reclaimed her own fate. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. Wya looked up at the warriors behind Jack, her gaze meeting theirs. They had not just fought for her. They had fought for every injustice that had been done to their people, and in that moment they had won. The air in the chapel shifted as the warriors began to file out, their heads held high. As Jack and Wya stood in the doorway, watching the warriors depart, a sense of peace settled over them. This battle had been won, but Jack knew it was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done, much to be rebuilt. But today, at least, they had made a stand for what was right. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt hope stirring within him, a quiet promise that justice, though slow and often painful, could be achieved. As the last of the warriors disappeared into the distance, Jack and Wya stood in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, its golden light bathing the land in a soft glow. It was a new beginning, for both of them and for the land they called home. Days passed, and the weight of what had occurred at the chapel began to settle in. Jack Dalton stood at the edge of his small ranch, watching the horizon as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The land stretched out before him, wild and untamed, just like the lives of the people who lived upon it. Wya had returned to her people, but her presence lingered in the air. She had come to him, desperate, fearful, and now she was free. The warriors, strong and silent, had left their mark on the town. Though the sheriff had gone, there were still whispers in the streets, murmurs of what had happened, of how the Apache had stood their ground and how a cowboy had joined them in their fight for justice. Jack was no stranger to the way things worked in this part of the world. He had seen it all, the cruelty, the prejudice, the bloodshed. But something about this time felt different. The land was shifting, and so was the balance of power. He had done what was right, but now the question hung in the air, what came next? As the days wore on, Jack's life slowly returned to a rhythm of sorts, but it was no longer the same. He spent his mornings working with the cattle, his mind always wandering back to the moment when he had stood up for what was right. He had made a stand, but he didn't know if it was enough. He didn't know if it would change anything in the long run. One afternoon, as he rode his horse along the fence line, a rider approached. The dust cloud kicked up by the horse's hooves signaled someone was coming. Jack reined in his horse, watching as the figure drew closer. It was Waya. Her face was calm, but Jack could see the weight of something in her eyes. "Jack!" she called out, her voice soft but carrying the authority of someone who had found her place in the world. "I came to thank you." Jack tipped his hat, his expression unreadable. "There's no need for that," he replied, his voice steady. "You don't owe me anything." Waya shook her head, dismounting from her horse and walking toward him. "You saved me," she said simply. "But you saved more than that. You saved our people." Jack didn't know what to say. He had acted without thinking, without fully understanding what he was doing, but it seemed that Waya understood something deeper than he did. "The fight is far from over," she continued, looking out over the land. "We've taken one step, but there are many more to come." Jack nodded slowly. He had a feeling that this was just the beginning. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Waya said, "we rebuild. We work together to create something better. And we fight for those who cannot fight for themselves." Jack could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had seen in the warriors who had stood beside him. It was a fire that burned for justice, for something greater than themselves. "I don't know if I'm the right man for that," Jack admitted, his gaze falling to the ground. "But I'll help however I can." Waya smiled, her expression softening. "You've already done more than enough," she said. "Now we build a future. Together." Jack watched as Waya mounted her horse once more, her presence commanding the landscape in a way that was impossible to ignore. She was no longer the woman in need of saving, she was a leader, a force to be reckoned with. As she rode off, Jack turned his horse around and headed back to his ranch. The weight of the world still pressed down on him, but now there was something else, too, a sense of purpose. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. They had fought together for justice, and maybe, just maybe, they could build something worth fighting for. The days following Waya's visit were quiet, but Jack Dalton couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the horizon. As the summer heat lingered, he worked on his ranch, repairing fences and mending the barn, but his thoughts were never far from the Apache tribe. It was as if a new chapter had begun, one where he was no longer just a bystander. A sense of purpose had taken root within him, one he hadn't felt in years. Late one afternoon, as the sun began to sink beneath the horizon, Jack stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the cattle graze. His mind wandered to the words Waya had spoken. "We build a future. Together." But Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. The world they lived in was still divided, filled with old wounds and prejudice. Even after the sheriff's defeat, there were those who wouldn't let go of the past. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of hooves. Jack turned, squinting into the setting sun to see a lone rider approaching. His heart quickened when he recognized the figure. It was Waya. She was riding with the same confidence she had shown when she stood beside him in the chapel, her posture straight, her eyes focused on the road ahead. As she drew closer, Jack could see that she was not alone. Behind her, a small group of Apache warriors rode in a loose formation. Jack's chest tightened with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. He had expected things to settle, not escalate. Waya pulled her horse to a stop before Jack, her face serious but calm. "We need your help again," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight Jack hadn't heard before. Jack raised an eyebrow, stepping forward. "What's happened?" Waya glanced back at the warriors, then met Jack's eyes. "There are others. People who are still set on keeping us in our place. They're trying to push us out of the land we've lived on for generations. We need to show them we won't back down." Jack's heart sank as he realized the challenge before them. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low. "Ranchers from the south. Some have been using their influence to claim Apache land. They've already started pushing families off their land, and now they're coming for more. They think they can do whatever they want." Waya's eyes softened for a moment, but the resolve in them was unshakable. "We need your help, Jack. You know this land better than anyone. You've fought for what's right before. Will you stand with us again? Jack didn't hesitate. He could feel the weight of the decision, but he knew what he had to do. I've already stood with you once, he said. And I'll do it again. The Apache warriors behind Waya nodded in silent agreement, their faces a mix of respect and gratitude. Waya smiled, but there was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of knowing that the fight was far from over. Thank you, she said quietly. We'll need every hand we can get. The sooner we act, the better. Jack took a deep breath, looking out over the land he had worked for so many years. This land, once his alone, was now part of something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of unity. He wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone. Together, they could stand against the forces that sought to divide them. Let's get to work, Jack said, his voice steady, his resolve firm. The Apache warriors mounted their horses once more, and Jack turned his own horse toward the heart of the ranch, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they rode together, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of the future pressing down on them all. But he also felt something else, a spark of hope. This wasn't just about defending a piece of land. It was about defending a way of life, a belief in justice that couldn't be erased by power or fear. The battle ahead would be hard, but it was one worth fighting. And for the first time in his life, Jack Dalton knew exactly what he was fighting for. As Jack Dalton rode alongside Waya and the Apache warriors, he could feel the weight of the task ahead. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the land. He had been on this ranch for years, working the cattle, fixing the fences, living in peace. But now, everything was changing. The world he had known was shifting, and he was being pulled into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The group moved quietly through the dusk, their horses' hooves making little sound on the soft earth. Jack could feel the tension in the air, but he kept his focus ahead. Waya rode beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her presence was steady, but Jack could see the determination in her face. She wasn't just fighting for her people anymore, she was fighting for a future that she believed in, and that was something Jack could understand. We're getting close, Waya said after a while, breaking the silence. They'll be waiting for us. Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't know who exactly they were going up against, but he could guess. The ranchers from the south, the ones who had been trying to claim land that didn't belong to them. The ones who thought they could push the Apache off what was rightfully theirs. Jack had heard the whispers, seen the signs. But he had never thought it would come to this. We'll make it count, Jack said, his voice steady. They won't take what's not theirs. Waya glanced at him, her expression softening for a moment. Thank you, Jack, she said quietly. For everything. Jack met her gaze, his heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew this was a fight worth having. As they approached the small town where the ranchers were based, Jack could feel his pulse quicken. The tension was palpable. The warriors behind them moved like shadows, silent and strong. They were ready, and Jack knew he had to be too. The group stopped at the edge of the town, just out of sight of the ranchers' camp. Jack and Wyatt dismounted, and the warriors fanned out, taking positions to watch the surroundings. Jack looked at Wyatt, his brow furrowed. What's the plan? He asked. Wyatt nodded, her voice low but clear. We'll make contact at dawn. I'll speak to their leaders, try to reason with them. But if they don't listen... She let the sentence trail off, the unspoken meaning hanging between them. Jack felt a heavy weight settle over him. It wasn't just about defending land anymore. It was about defending lives. The lives of the Apache, the lives of the ranchers who had been misled, and his own life as well. As night settled over the land, the group camped in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Jack lay on his bedroll, staring up at the stars, trying to calm his mind. He had never been one for long speeches or grand gestures. He was just a cowboy, a rancher, a man who worked the land. But tonight, as he thought about Waya, about the warriors, and about everything that was at stake, he realized that this was more than just a fight for land. It was a fight for justice for the future. He wasn't just standing up for the Apache or the ranchers. He was standing up for something much bigger. The night passed slowly, but the morning came quickly, and with it, the dawn of a new day. The air was crisp, the sun barely touching the horizon as Jack and Waya, along with the warriors, made their way toward the ranchers' camp. There was no turning back now. As they reached the camp, Jack could see the ranchers gathered around a fire, their faces hard and determined. They looked at the approaching group with suspicion, but Jack could also see something else: fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of change. Jack rode forward, Waya at his side. The warriors remained behind, watching carefully. Waya held up her hand, signaling for Jack to stop. She turned to him, her face set with determination. "I'll speak first," she said. "I'll try to reach them. But if they don't listen, we'll do what we must." Jack nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He didn't know if this would end in peace or conflict, but he knew one thing for sure. He had already made his choice. And he wasn't about to back down. Waya rode forward alone, her horse steady under her, and the ranchers watched as she approached. The firelight flickered in her eyes, and for the first time, Jack saw something different in her. It wasn't just the determination he had seen before. It was something else, something that came from deep within her, something that made her stand tall, even in the face of those who wished to harm her. This was her fight. And now, Jack realized, it was his too. Waya rode forward, her horse's hooves soft against the earth, as she approached the rancher's camp. The morning mist was just beginning to lift, and the sun cast long shadows over the rugged land. Jack watched from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. The warriors remained behind, but the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Waya was alone now, facing the men who had come to take everything from her people. She didn't seem afraid, though. Her back was straight, her eyes focused on the group gathered around the fire. As she drew closer, the ranchers fell silent, their eyes watching her every move. It was clear they hadn't expected a woman, especially not one like her, to be the one to confront them. But Waya wasn't just any woman. She was a leader, and in that moment she commanded respect. "I've come to speak with you," Waya called out, her voice calm but firm. The leader of the ranchers, a man named Luke Harris, stepped forward. He was tall, with a rough face and hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime working the land. His eyes were cold, calculating. "We don't have much to say to you, Apache," he said, his voice thick with disdain. Waya's gaze never wavered. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I'm here to make it clear that this land is not yours to take. You have no claim over what belongs to my people." The silence stretched for a moment, and then Luke scoffed. "And what do you plan to do about it? You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're nothing but savages." Jack could see the tension rising in Waya's shoulders, but she didn't flinch. "You're wrong," she said. "We're not savages. We've survived through generations, not because of violence, but because of our strength, our unity, and our will to survive. You underestimate us, but that's your mistake." Luke stepped closer, his boots crunching on the ground. "I don't care about your people's history. This is about what's rightfully ours. And if you're here to stop us, then we'll deal with you like we deal with any threat." Jack could feel the anger bubbling inside him, but he kept his place, watching Waya carefully. This wasn't his fight to fight, not yet. This was Waya's moment, her chance to prove what she and her people stood for. "If you think violence will solve this," Waya said, her voice low and steady, "then you're already lost." The words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. "We're not here to fight, but we won't let you take what's ours. You've been pushing us for too long, and we're done being silent." The ranchers exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a fight, but they hadn't expected this. "We've heard your threats," Luke said, though there was uncertainty in his voice now. "But we've been patient. We've waited for you to leave on your own. But now you're forcing our hand?" Waya's eyes narrowed. I'm not forcing anyone's hand, she said. I'm just asking for what's right. But if you choose to make it a fight, we'll fight. But I promise you, it will be the last fight you ever have over this land. The ranchers stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. Jack could feel the weight of the words. He had known that this would come to a head eventually, but hearing Waya speak with such conviction made him realize how deep the divide truly was. He didn't know how it would end, but he knew that Waya had already won the most important battle. She had stood up, not with force, but with truth. And in that moment, Jack saw a side of her that made him proud. This wasn't about land or cattle. This was about something much bigger, a fight for respect, for dignity, for the right to exist without fear. We're not going anywhere, Waya continued, her voice unwavering. You can keep pushing, but you won't break us. Not now, not ever. The ranchers hesitated, the fire crackling between them, the sound of the wind stirring the dust around them. Jack stayed where he was, waiting for the moment when everything would change. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this much: Waya wasn't backing down. And neither was he. The battle for this land was far from over, but the first step had been taken, and there was no turning back now. The silence stretched between the ranchers and the Apache warriors, the tension palpable as both sides waited for something to give. Jack Dalton stood at the edge of the group, watching Waya with a sense of awe. She had done what many thought impossible. She had confronted the ranchers, not with violence, but with the strength of her words, the power of her people's truth. The sun continued to rise, painting the landscape in soft shades of gold and red, but it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. You don't have to do this, Luke Harris, the rancher leader, finally said, his voice betraying a trace of doubt. His eyes flicked between Waya and the warriors behind her, all of them standing tall, unwavering. We've made our plans. There's no turning back now. Waya's gaze never wavered as she stood before him, her expression calm but resolute. There's always a choice, she said quietly. You can continue down the path of greed and cruelty, or you can listen and understand. But it's up to you. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Jack could feel the shift happening, the slow but undeniable turning of the tide. He knew that the land they stood on was more than just a place to farm or live. It was sacred to Waya and her people. It held memories, history, and life itself. And now, it was under threat once more. I don't think you understand what you're asking, Luke said, taking a step back. We've been here longer than you, and we've built something. You're asking us to give it all up. Waya's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. I'm not asking you to give it up, she said. I'm asking you to share it. To respect what belongs to all of us. The ranchers exchanged uneasy glances. There was a long moment of silence, but it was broken when one of the warriors stepped forward, his voice strong. You've already taken more than your share. Now it's time to return what you've stolen. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations. Jack knew this wasn't just about one piece of land or one fight. It was about years of history, years of injustice, that had led them here. The ranchers, still on edge, shifted uncomfortably. Luke looked at the warriors, then at Jack. What's he talking about? He demanded. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. It's about more than just land, Luke. It's about respect. The land has been taken, yes, but it's been taken from people who had no voice in it. This isn't just your fight. It's everyone's fight. Luke's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack thought he might lash out. But instead, the rancher looked away, his jaw tight with frustration. I didn't ask for this. None of us did, Luke muttered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held earlier. And yet here we are, Waya said, her tone soft but resolute. You can either stand with us, or you can continue to fight a losing battle. But remember this, what you're fighting for is not yours to keep. Not anymore. Luke opened his mouth to respond but paused, as if the weight of her words had sunk in. He looked at the warriors, their faces unreadable, then back to Jack. What do you want from us? He asked. Waya's gaze never left him. We want what's right. We want peace, and we want to rebuild. This land can be shared. But only if you're willing to let go of what you think you're entitled to. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but something in Luke's posture softened. He looked at the others, his eyes shifting between the warriors and his own men. Finally, he let out a long breath. We'll need time, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of reluctant acceptance. Time to think. Time to talk. But we'll meet you halfway. Waya nodded, her expression softening for the first time. That's all we ask? The air seemed to lighten as the tension began to dissolve, the stalemate broken, but Jack knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There was much to rebuild, and many more obstacles to face. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. The sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the land, and Jack stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment shift from one of conflict to one of hope. This was the first step in a long journey, but it was a step in the right direction. Weeks passed since the meeting at the rancher's camp, and the uneasy peace between the Apache and the settlers began to settle into a fragile understanding. Jack Dalton had been working harder than ever, trying to keep up with the ranch, while also helping Waya and her people navigate this new chapter. The land was still theirs, but the future was far from certain. The settlers, though willing to meet halfway, were still hesitant, and Jack could see it in their eyes. They didn't trust the Apache, nor did they trust the changes that were unfolding before them. Yet Jack found something within himself that he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. Waya had returned to her people, working alongside the Apache leaders, and Jack had found his place helping to mediate between the two sides. There were still disagreements, small skirmishes, and old wounds, but at least now there was dialogue. There was hope for the future. One late afternoon, as Jack worked on mending a broken fence near the creek, he spotted a figure approaching from the distance. Waya rode alone this time, her horse steady beneath her. As she drew closer, Jack could see the tension in her posture. Something had changed. She was different, but in a way he couldn't quite place. She dismounted without a word, walking toward him with a quiet confidence. Jack, she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made his chest tighten. There's something we need to discuss. Jack put down his tools and turned to face her. What's happened? He asked. Waya hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the land before locking with his. The settlers, she said slowly. They've agreed to the terms we set, but there's more. There are whispers of resistance from those who want to see things return to the way they were. I'm afraid some of them won't accept the peace we've forged. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. He had hoped that the progress they had made would be enough to quiet the dissenters. But as always, there were those who wouldn't let go of their prejudices, no matter how much change had occurred. So what do we do? Jack asked. Waya's gaze softened, but her determination remained. We need to stay vigilant. There are some who would use fear to tear this fragile peace apart. But we can't give in to fear. We need to show them that this land, this future, is worth fighting for. Not with violence, but with strength. Jack nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. We've come too far to let it all fall apart now, he said, his voice steady. Waya smiled, though it was a smile tinged with sadness. I knew I could count on you, she said. But there's more. I need you to come with me. There's something I need to show you. Jack followed Waya as she led him away from the creek and toward the edge of the land, where the land met the hills in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. They walked in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. When they reached the edge of the hills, Waya stopped, looking out over the land. This is what's at stake, she said quietly. Jack looked out at the sprawling land before them, the sun low in the sky, casting golden light over the hills. It was beautiful, peaceful, but Jack could feel the uncertainty in the air. This is our future, Waya continued. And it's worth protecting. But we can't do it alone. We need to stand together, all of us. Not just the Apache or the settlers. but everyone who believes in what's right. Jack felt a surge of pride as he looked at Waya. She had come so far from the woman who had once been dragged into that chapel, and now, she was leading her people, not with force, but with wisdom. "I'll stand with you," Jack said, his voice firm. "We'll stand together." Waya nodded, her eyes meeting his with a quiet strength. "Then we have a chance?" she said. The two of them stood together, looking out at the land, their land, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but it was a road they would walk side by side. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt the weight of his choices lift. He wasn't just defending a piece of land. He was defending a future where everyone, no matter their background, had a place to stand. And that was something worth fighting for.